Hello, and welcome to another episode of Bimbo Bookshelf. My name is Britt, and today Sophie and I will be speaking with Dr. Dawn Owen. Dawn is a former teacher, a historian, and a lifelong educator who also happens to have a deep connection with this story. We met through the book club's Instagram page around the time we were getting prepared to meet for our live discussion around Ishmael about a year and a half ago. Dawn shares with us his personal connection with the book, what it was like meeting the author, and many more things. So settle in and listen up as we close out our discussion on the remarkable book that is Ishmael.
We really appreciate you coming on and being somebody that we can kind of trust and work with to interview, because it's definitely been a learning curve anytime we record. So if you wanted to just sort of introduce yourself, I was thinking maybe like your educational background, a bit about yourself in relationship to the book and the themes, and then maybe how you first came across Ishmael.
Yeah, that's a lot. So my name's Don, and I've been a lifelong student and a lifelong educator. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in just a second. But yeah, my first experience with Ishmael actually was a good friend of mine from college gave it to me the year it came out. He read it right away, and he's given me several books, but two books are probably two of the most life-changing books I've ever read. The first one was one he gave me upon graduation as I was heading off to be a idealistic young history teacher looking to change the world. And that book was Neil Postman's book called Teaching is a Subversive Activity. And that is a phenomenal book. And I read it right away. I think as I was doing my student teaching in Minneapolis South High School. I grew up in Minnesota and went to Carleton College, majored in psychology and minored in history education and educational studies. Neil Postman's book, Teaching as a Subversive Activity, is one of those books that you have to be ready for. And I don't think I was ready for it when I was reading it, doing my student teaching. I ended up putting it away for almost 35 years. And as my education career in public education came to an abrupt end, I picked it up again. And it was one of those books that's like, it's transformed the way I think about educational systems. It also fits perfectly with Ishmael. And so I give full credit to my friend Steve, who may listen to this podcast at some point, because he gave me that book. And then he also gave me Ishmael a few years later. And I read Ishmael right away and just devoured it. As a history teacher, it was just fascinating to read a book that delved into history and culture in ways that I had never thought about. And I identified a lot with the narrator, as I think many people do. Sure. I hope many people do. And I became one of those people that kind of became a Daniel Quinn fanboy. And I bought extra copies and I kept them in my classroom library. I taught 8th grade U.S. history at a middle school in a Midwest, very progressive community. And I actually read parts of it out loud to my students at times and asked them to think differently about where they got their ideas. That worked okay, but I also learned in the 90s that you had the same kinds of groups that you're seeing in the 2020s. There's a group in our community called TIPS, to inform our parents about schools, which said that any books or curriculum that talked about things in an anti-American way or had talking animals, or I could go on this list. I was I had a formal, I had a formal complaint. Right. So I had a formal complaint lodged against me by this group. And it wasn't just around Ishmael. It was around the fact that I was teaching Columbus using a curriculum called Rethinking Columbus, which then turned into Rethinking Schools, which is a history curriculum that does a lot of counter narrative work, what I would call real history. But so Ishmael became a book that I just fell in love with, and I'm holding up a copy right now that unfortunately is like not a copy that has my notes in it or my Post-it notes in it, because I've given away the last 3 copies that I've read, and the last time I read it was in 2019. And that copy not only had my notes, but also my dad's notes. My dad and I think, probably are responsible for giving away about 30 copies of Ishmael to friends, families.
That's
and
incredible.
We wanted to try and influence or mess with their minds. So back to Daniel Quinn for a second. When I was teaching, I went to several state, regional, and national conferences for social studies educators. And I'll never forget, I was at one in St. Louis, and I was in the what do you call it, the exhibition hall, where all the vendors have their books and their swag that they're giving away. And I'm walking through, and all of a sudden I see a poster that looks very familiar, and it was the leaf with the sun, right? And it said, it was like the poster that you would picture in Ishmael's room. It said, "Teacher seeks pupil."
Oh my gosh.
And I looked, and there's Daniel Quinn sitting by himself behind this booth, and he's selling and signing books. And I like flipped out.
That's amazing.
And then for like the next 3 years, every big conference that I went to, he was there. And it really, like, my memory of one of them, I can picture him sitting in the lobby of the hotel, the conference hotel, and he literally was surrounded by like 30 people who were sitting at his feet. And he was this kind of guru, the kind of thing that he didn't want to be, but he was. And I was listening to your episode 1, and I thought about that moment as I was listening, about how, part of what he didn't want was, he didn't want to become this like guru or sage or anything, but he definitely was, and he played the part really well. I remember him as a fairly short, not round, but semi-round individual with graying hair and a gray beard. And he just had the sweetest personality, and he would just start talking, and people would just like go silent and just listen to him. And so I was telling Britt earlier that I have a couple signed copies that are somewhere, and I have no idea. I think one of them I may have given away the last time I read the book in 2019 to a good friend who enjoyed it as much as I did. And it was interesting because as you were talking in episode 1 about when you both read the book, I was listening to that and I was like, I knew the date, because I was following a hashtag of Ishmael on Instagram.
Oh,
and
yes.
all of a sudden this post popped up from Bimbo Bookshelf. And I'm like, well, that's one of the most interesting names I've ever heard. And it was Ishmael. And I was like, this is the coolest thing. And you were talking about doing an Instagram live around Ishmael.
Right.
And I like put it on my calendar, and I was there, and I've been a fan of both of you since then. And
that's such a compliment.
Well, I really,
really,
you've done an amazing job with the books that you've read, and with your presentation of not just the content of the books, but also how you integrate them with your lives. It's been a phenomenal thing for me to listen to. And as a history teacher, I get very strong vibes of how thorough you both are in your research, and how just how scholarly you attack the text that you read. So I'm going to stop talking, because I don't know that I've introduced myself well, and I've already jumped into discussing the book and discussing your podcast as well. So
that's perfect, honestly. And that really, thank you for saying that. That means so much. And I can't speak for Sophia, but I know that, we kind of briefly talked about this before, but hearing big props from a history teacher to two formerly homeschooled kids, that like really makes us feel good, because I think, at least for me, growing up, books were something that made me feel like I could educate myself. They felt like a way out of the mindset that I wanted to escape and the places that I didn't want to be at anymore. And Ishmael was very much one of these books too. And I just think it's great that we have you on here to talk about this. I didn't realize that you hadn't actually met the author prior to his death. That's incredible to know that. Sophia and I have both said that it seems that we have this proclivity to find authors shortly after they've passed away and just become very attached to their work and feel this sort of loss of that person being gone and not being able to dig in their mind anymore. But I think, like you said about Daniel Quinn, he really has kind of left a legacy of, whether it was wanted to be, a guru or someone to look up to, as really an example to remind us all that it's important to seek education outside of the box. It's important to really step up and say something when you feel like the world isn't working the way that it should. And this is the kind of book that I think really sparks these kinds of conversations within people. And it's probably why you've given away close to 30 copies, why I gave away Sophia's copy, and I do owe you one back. When Sophia let me borrow the book, I gave it away.
I mean, but that's what all I could hope for. And I love the idea of it being out there in the world. Like I love that what you're saying, Dawn, about how you've like given away so many copies, that the friend that recommended it to me has done the same thing. And I feel like this is definitely a book that has that like kind of impact. And I think that part of it is like, you can't necessarily have some of these conversations with people if you don't necessarily feel like they are on the same page, or maybe you're just kind of feeling like this is waking you up for the first time yourself. So it's almost like a way of, connecting and sharing that. So I love that we all kind of have that in common. And also that you had the connection with your dad, that he like shared your passion for that, because that was like, that's just really heartwarming.
Yeah, thank you. It is wild. I wanted to say one thing about your collective story, because I've heard you talk about being homeschooled, and as someone who was a public school educator and administrator for my entire for 35 years of my life, let me just put it that way. I thought a lot about that, and when I was listening to your episode 1, and you were talking about this idea of, I think you used the term, being in a cult and coming out of the cult, right?
Right.
So one of the themes of Ishmael is this idea of captivity, and you both talked about it in the first one, right? So one of the things that you were never captives of was you were never captives of public education, right? You might have been captives of your religion and your family culture and upbringing, but public education, one of the things that I learned was public education is one of the largest and most intractable, I don't know if that's the right word.
It's like the fundamental grounds for societal brainwashing and coercion.
Right. And so I hate to use those phrases, right? Because it sounds very quickly like I'm saying public education is indoctrinating people. Well, it is. And then all of a sudden I'm sounding like some of your neighbors in your great state. Where you
oh yeah. Well, what's interesting that you say that, because I do think that some people's viewpoints simply just can never understand. But I think that to some degree, what's so wonderful about this book in particular is that it kind of touches on that thing that seems to be a neutral topic for everyone, which is not wanting anyone else to have say or control over their story. And no matter what brand of that you're into, whether it's positive and good for you or whether you're a person that needs some healing, like a lot of our neighbors down here in the South do. I mean, I think that that's one thing that's really so wonderful about this book is that it gives kind of a blank space for you to teach yourself what that really means. At least for me, I felt that about this book. And like you were saying about public education, you know, that's one thing that I had really felt like was a disadvantage to me my entire life. And now that I'm an adult, it is something, especially having children of my own that are in the public school system, seeing the difference in how I learned growing up and seeing the difference how they learned, it really is just incredibly, shockingly different. And it's interesting. It's interesting because it doesn't mean that it's necessarily all bad or all good, because I do think as far as public school systems, there is definitely a lot of indoctrination, but I do see a positive, like the positivity in bringing children out into their communities, being around the kids that are in their neighborhoods, learning how to get along with people they wouldn't know otherwise. I think there is definitely some use for it. It could just be a lot better.
Yeah, and it has to provide space for alternate ideas, and it also has to not just provide space, but it also has to somehow work on being inclusive in that space. That's where I see so many connections between the book I referenced before, Neil Postman's book, Teaching as a Subversive Activity, and Ishmael, is this idea that we do have agency in our lives and we do have some sense of responsibility. Teachers make 10,000 decisions, in the first 2 hours of the school day that have huge impacts on their students and have nothing to do with the written curriculum or the mandated curriculum, or whatever you want to call it, or national mandates. My dissertation was on the ways that No Child Left Behind was implemented by principals who identify themselves as social justice leaders. And that was fascinating because many of them identified No Child Left Behind as a piece of legislation that was couched in issues of social justice, and yet it was implemented in such ways that it absolutely did the opposite. It reinforced what public education does so wonderfully, which is sort, select, and discriminate against people who do not fit the dominant culture. And that goes right back into Ishmael, because the dominant culture is so prevalent that it's sometimes hard to see beyond it. And when you do start to see beyond it, I reread just a section near the end where the narrator was talking about being lonely and depressed because he was starting to see the world differently, and he realized that he couldn't explain it to anyone else, and he was feeling like this tension of how do I even begin? And I've felt that many times in my career and in my life, is this sense of I see the world differently and I can't explain it to people. I think that's a big theme in Ishmael, and it's always good to come back to the book and the text and remind myself that, yeah, we do. And so if you just put this in there, right, we have agency and responsibility over our lives. You just wrote that in our group chat here. And I think that's so important. And I'll let you talk more about that.
Yeah, I just love everything that you're saying, because when I was preparing for meeting up today, one of the things that I was thinking about was how I wanted to revisit the rest of the book, what I wanted to talk about as we kind of wrapped things up, and also just kind of reconsidering our conversation from the first episode about this. And one of the things that we talked about a lot and that I felt like I was really struggling with articulating was revisiting the kind of grief and loss and loneliness that you're talking about that I felt when I initially read this book. And also, as I was kind of like processing a lot of the adjacent topics that I got into as a result of it, like, really deep green movement or like anti-civ stuff. And also, at the time working in an industrial warehouse, a shipping warehouse overnight, none of these things are good for your mental health, really. And also just seeing the reality of like our society and our lifestyle. But I feel like a thing that I've really shifted since that time, and like that I wanted to reflect on since then, is I do think that now I've kind of overcome that narrative that I also had. Like, I realized that another story or myth that I had developed within the realm of my thinking was this, the capitalism realism, the idea of there is no alternative, the idea that nothing that I do matters. And I don't think that when I initially read Ishmael, I identified that that was one of the myths that I was telling too. But when we revisited that first episode and I was thinking how I could reframe, like, well, I don't feel depressed about this anymore. I do feel hopeful. I was thinking really about how Brittany highlighted like the way that stories can heal. So I thought a lot about all of that, and I'm happy that you brought that forward. And also happy that we're all, I think, not feeling dismayed by it. We're all feeling like we have opportunities to create within our personal agency and responsibility.
This definitely feels like a safe group for that. And I think, Dawn, what you were talking about, as soon as you said that I remembered we had all three of us separately have had conversations about this part of the book, about that when you get that feeling of knowing something's wrong, but unable to name it in your society. And he says in this book that once you learn to discern the voice of mother culture humming in the background, telling her story over and over again to the people of your culture, you'll never stop being conscious of it. So he is basically saying once you do figure that out, you can never unhear it. And Dawn, like you were saying, and I was hoping maybe you could speak to a little bit how you did kind of have that awakening and mind change that ultimately led to your career change out of education. If you could speak about that a little bit.
Sure. I want to address one thing first because it was in my notes. When you texted and said, let's record and invited me on, there was one thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit that's bothered me with Ishmael. And it bothered me in 2019 when the last time I read it through and took copious notes in it. And it's the term mother culture, right? And I'd never really noticed it before. And I don't know if it's just the evolution of the concept of matriarchy versus patriarchy, but the fact that mother culture is the keeper of our stories, and the stories that are essentially stories of takers, and mother culture is a taker story, that bothered me. And I just wanted to put that out there, right? That all of a sudden I was like, I was having this tension with, I wanted to talk to Daniel Quinn, and I wanted to say, why mother culture? When clearly we're in a patriarchal society, and that actually the agricultural revolution that Ishmael does such a wonderful job explaining is still going on, right? The revolution is still happening right in front of us, and we're still participants in this agricultural and industrial revolution. That was a shift from matriarchal societies to patriarchal societies. Those things coincided. And I want to have a discussion there. And I don't know that I'm ready to like dig deep.
Well, I actually have a theory. Okay. Yeah. And this is just a theory that I've made up on the spot. So it's not thought out. And I might regret it later, but here we are. So as I was hearing you say that, I never thought about this before and never considered it. But the book that we're currently reading in the book club, Androgyny, kind of talks about this. At least the part that I'm reading right now is basically talking about the functionality, like the difference in society from the matriarch to the patriarch and how like historically that has changed. I feel like a big theme in this book and other books that Sophia and I have read a lot recently, it's kind of this underlying telling that storytelling of itself is healing, that it is power. And mother culture, she whispers in your ear, she tells the story that you want to hear. I feel like mother culture is something that we're more okay with listening to, especially in a patriarchal society. And maybe that's got nothing to do with it, but I feel like when you hear the whispers of mother culture, or you think of a mother or a soft feminine figure whispering to you, it goes through your ear so easy. When I think of a
it's patriarchal
system, right? When I think of a patriarchal system, I think of rough and rigid and something to rebel against. But mother culture just, it makes sense to me to some degree that it's the quiet whisper voice that people don't even realize that they're listening to. So
wow,
that's my new theory.
Really interesting. I actually know a little bit to answer this, Dawn, but I can't find like info on it anywhere. I've been like frantically Googling while y'all are talking.
Oh, that's the worst
feeling. But I know that at some point there was like a FAQ that I read from Daniel Quinn, or like a question and answer where people had addressed questions to him. And one of them specifically was, why did you name this mother culture? And if I could just paraphrase from what I remember, he essentially said like, it wasn't, it wasn't something that he did from the instinct of misogyny. He did address that because he has had like people say that. And I think that is a really fair thing to bring forward. Like, I'm glad that you mentioned that. And I feel like that's something that matters a lot to both of us. And it's something I appreciate that you care about. And I'm trying to remember now, like, I basically think it was kind of similar to what Brittany's saying. Like, he thought of it as it's the thing that it's kind of like the nurture, I think, as he was kind of associating it, and also like that it's the subtle, it's there in the undercurrent. But now that I'm talking about it, I'm like, I really got to find this. But I know that at some point he's addressed it. He's also addressed like, why didn't he use gender neutral language, and why he made the narrator a man, which I can drop in the chat and we could talk about. But I was also going to say that, Dawn, I really was glad that you brought forward the idea of shifting from, and like if we just say hunter-gatherer society with a matriarchal focus versus like agrarian culture, and therefore civilization being a patriarchal focus. Because, if someone like myself feel like really engrossed in things like Magio-religious practices, or things that often are reconstructionist in nature when they talk about history, that is something I hear often. And I often like, I'm interested in the historical veracity of it. I hope for that, like it'd be nice if we've had contrast historically. And I think we should all be modern enough to like move towards something in the center. But like, it's just cool to hear that brought forward from you, like with your perspective about history. And that's definitely something that I would also say about this book that got me very curious about it. It's just history in general. Like I mentioned in the first episode, reading the Bible again, because I was like thinking about history differently, thinking about concepts a little bit differently, or just being willing to like, I guess, learn, which is an interesting thing that I hadn't really associated with this book too, is just like being willing to reconsider what I know, which I think is probably like the whole point, I think.
Yeah, when you said in the first episode about reading the Bible again, that brought back a memory of mine when I was reading Ishmael for the first time, which was, I remember calling my dad and I asked him if he could find my Bible, because when I was blanking on the word, when I went through confirmation in the Presbyterian Church, when I was confirmed, they gave everyone a small Bible with their name printed on it, right? And I didn't move that with me, because as soon as I was done with confirmation classes, I was done with organized religion. And that's been pretty much true for my entire life. And I called my dad and I asked him if they still had it, and they did. And so that's what got us talking, my dad and I talking about Ishmael. And he was just fascinated by my take and my interest in the Bible as a reference point to this broader conversation about society and culture. And so when you mentioned that, I was like, yeah, I had that exact same sensation, right? Is that, oh my gosh, it brought me back to a Bible that I never thought I would touch again. And yet it brought me back there in a way that allowed me to look at the Bible and the stories in the Bible differently, and also allowed me to see how those stories play out in such subtle ways. And I do want to come back to Brett, what you were saying about mother culture being this feminine whisper that is almost more you didn't use this word, but as you were talking, I was thinking about the word seductive, right? It's more seductive, and it's more like it's softer, and it's less, you don't want to rebel against it. That makes everything about the big concepts in Ishmael that much more powerful, because, and you asked me a question a while ago about how it fit into my leaving public education. And I will say I did not go willingly or quietly from public education. And just, I won't get into the details because that's for another podcast, or probably not actually.
Totally.
But,
okay.
As I became an administrator, I became more and more frustrated with the way the system of public education was set up to discriminate against people, and specifically people who had been historically marginalized, whether it was Black people who were experiencing poverty, people who were immigrants to this country. And that's historically, that's a big theme historically in most of our curriculum, is the way immigrants have been treated in this country. And yet it's always, it's always this melting pot. And so it's all good in the end. It's yay. Whereas you don't really talk about the fact that, no, actually what that is that's the real indoctrination into the dominant culture. And whether you're, white, Black, brown, English, Spanish, Congolese, in terms of language groups, you are all indoctrinated into the dominant culture by public education, and it does a wonderful job. And those people who don't fit are left behind. Look at the term, no child left behind. No, we're actually leaving people behind, and those that we don't want to leave behind, we will expel. My end of my career as an administrator was around issues of student discipline and disparity data among Black, white, and brown students. And our school district had done a lot of work with restorative practices, restorative justice, and we had reduced the number of out-of-school suspensions and expulsions massively over the course of about 3 or 4 years. That was exciting, and we celebrated that. But one day I was doing a data dig with a group of principals, and we looked at every kid that was suspended out of school at the high school level. Every kid except one was either Black or brown. And I'm like, we have created the perfectly inequitable system, right? Where we're celebrating this wonderful data that we're reducing the number of kids who are being suspended out of school, and yet we're making it so that we're not suspending any white kids out of school. And the only kids we were suspending out of school were Black and Latino. And that's true of many school districts, right? When I started to push on that, and I'm going to say this with not any kind of, no, I'm going to back up. When I started to push on that, the resistance that I got from multiple fronts was stronger and more vehement than I had imagined, because I live in a very progressive community. I'd grown up in this community in terms of as an adult. I moved here when I was 22. Was in one school district the entire time. I started as a substitute teacher and became superintendent of schools. I was shocked that I couldn't make those changes. And that as soon as I started doing things like saying, no, we're not going to expel any more kids until we figured out how to deal with this racial disparity issue, the proverbial wheels came off the school bus. And parent groups, teacher groups, community groups, taxpayers started to call me all kinds of names, from communist to socialist to Black nationalist. And right, it was to me, I lived through that in ways that were really interesting, but it said to me, it brought back that theme of Ishmael of we are captives in our systems, right? And I was a captive in that system. And even though I was at the top of a system, I thought I could change. It wasn't going to change. No matter how much power and influence I had in the school system, that was not going to change. And the pushback was incredibly harsh and incredibly painful for me, my family, and the entire community. I don't want to minimize that either. And it came from all sides. And I would say that the one thing that maybe kind of shifted the narrative in this community was COVID, because 2 years later, COVID hit, and all of a sudden, we now have racial disparities in our school districts where I live that pale in comparison to what they were before, because when COVID hit, we just lost families. And the families that we lost weren't white middle class or white working class or white upper middle class families. They were Black, brown, indigenous, and immigrant families. And they just disappeared. And many of them have not come back to public school.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for sharing that story, because I think a lot of time we have the best of faith that if we just keep working hard and keep fighting for the right thing and we keep showing up, that we can make change. And that's not to say that we can't. I definitely think it's possible. And I definitely think people coming together is the only way for that to be possible. But sometimes it takes a shocking series of events when you're trying to do good to really realize how confining systems that we live in and that we've built in this society can be. And it's scary, it's sad. And the truth of the matter is there really is not a lot of people willing to put their voice and neck out there and on the line because of that. And I would say probably even more so since 2020. Like you said, everything has increased. Everything has increased. The world has definitely changed. And, even people that do have the time and mean well and show up and do these things, it's going to take more than that, a collective reimagining of how to make change, which I think is an ongoing theme in this book too. And one thing that I really love about this book is that it kind of opened up my mind to the idea of healing through storytelling. This is something Sophia and I have talked a lot about. We talk a lot about our collective favorite author, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, and she has this book called Women Who Run with the Wolves that really had kind of opened my eyes to the idea that stories, fables, myths are reality to some degree, and that when we pay attention to stories as a community, it can be teaching tools. And this book is very much one of those teaching tools. It's a story. It is trying to help us understand the story around it and make sense of it and see how we can reimagine it. And I think that that's true with a lot of stories and a lot of books, and why especially Sophia and I, as formerly homeschooled, really dig into these books, because there really is a lot that storytelling can teach you, which honestly, I think kind of piggybacks on what you were saying on the way that these systems are set up, school in particular, education systems, since we happen to be on this track, with, I think about book bans. Like you said, they are presented as a protection from children, not wanting to expose children to violence or sexuality or things that they shouldn't be. But if you ever go through the book bans on, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, but on grade school public children, it's usually books about different family systems, different ways of living outside of the box and other people. And it does leave people behind, and it makes it harder for children to connect themselves with history and connect themselves with what they're learning, which puts them at a disadvantage because it's just something that they have to do and something that they're not a part of. Always struggle with. Go ahead. Yeah, no.
I didn't want to cut you off, but I just saw Even Cowgirls Get the Blues was a book that was banned on Duval County recently.
Oh, come on.
I'm pissed about that. I'm reading it right now. So
Even Cowgirls Get the Blues.
But, I love everything that y'all were saying, and especially that a collective reimagining of how to make change. Because when I was thinking about feeling less pessimistic and feeling more hopeful, a lot of that has to do with just moving from doing things that I feel like I had to do, like, for example, working a job that is unfulfilling and does not teach me any skills, and I am damaging my body by selling my labor, to doing something that I enjoy doing. And I think that does come with a level of privilege and personal accountability and acceptance that not everyone has the ability to do that. But something that I have really thought about in relationship to this book is what are the stories that we're telling ourselves? What are the myths that we're telling ourselves about our life, about how we live our lives? Yes, it is a physical reality that we all have to work and on some level sell our labor and our time in order to maintain our existence. But can we reimagine what that looks like? Can we be more creative? Can we be willing to accept the trade-off for working something that's more fulfilling if we make less money? Is that an option for us? And I think that's so many of us don't feel like it is, which I think is why there's that sense of stuckness or frustration. But there was just something that you were saying that made me think about that. And I was just going to add too, I've been thinking a lot about the words of author Toni Cade Bambaro, who said the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. And you guys have both mentioned something about the idea of, what we say and what we imagine and how it could be also enticing or exciting or reimagine things. And I think that's part of what Britt was getting at with, the idea of story being healing, and that the stories that we tell can shift how we look at things. Because one tangible result that I've had is, part of shifting what I do for vocation and spending more time in my community is that I also now work with people who are involved in regenerative agriculture or urban agriculture or homesteading. Whereas maybe when I first read this book, I was obsessed with the honestly fantasy that I needed to sell my home and move and buy a plot of land, and that somehow that would magically make me able to keep plants alive and able to shift every single bad habit in my life, not to put a value judgment on it, but these habits that are part of these destructive ways of being that we're, frankly indoctrinated into, right? And now I'm thinking about okay, could I be present with my local ecosystem? What does that look like? What does it look like to find ways of getting food that I know the hands that produced it? What does it look like to sort of scale back, and even just meeting myself where I'm at, if that means, eating something out of my freezer instead of eating Taco Bell, I think that's a win, thinking about those kinds of things to throw back to our last episode.
I was just about to say, we should start a tally of how many episodes we mentioned Taco Bell in, and then maybe one day they'll sponsor us and we'll get that Baja Blast River that we've always dreamed of.
Right. Oh my God.
I really appreciate
that really
what
is the thing of dreams.
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't want to float down the rivers of the Baja Blast? Come on now. But I really appreciate what you were saying, because I know that you know this, but I obviously had the same thought because we had talked about buying land and doing this together. And then,
Yes.
hello, we have validation. We're telling each other this is the right answer, to both of us really getting to a point where it's like, okay, well, what would that actually mean? What would that actually take from us now and require from us in the future? And then slowly kind of realizing that maybe these huge lifestyle changes and system changes and things that are so out of our reality to control, maybe those aren't the real answers into taking the steps to change the narrative in our lives. Maybe it is as simple as knowing the hands that made your food, or like you said, being present to your local ecosystem. I laughed when you were saying that if you bought a plot of land that maybe that meant you could keep a plant alive, because my house plants, they never make it. You know what I'm saying? I'm embarrassed, honestly, as a elder millennial. I feel like I should have at least 10 to 20 plants alive in my home, but that's not the reality.
Plant girl transition.
It just didn't happen for me. I'm very blessed, happy, and fortunate that I've been able to keep my dogs and children alive, but the plants, it just doesn't really happen. So for me, I know that that's not going to happen without a collective. You have to stop at some point and think, what is my role in creating the myth and story and culture out that I want to live? And maybe by doing so, I can inspire others, because there's only so much that we can control about our surroundings and what's around us, And it takes a whole village, as they say, it takes community. It takes the whole culture as a collective offering what they have to offer, to be able to change the dynamic of society.
So I have like 5 or 6 thoughts. And then as you two were talking, one of the things that I enjoy talking to other people about books, why I enjoy talking to other people about books, is the connections that it makes to books from my past, but also I'm pulling books out of both of you that I'm like writing things down and making connections of books that I haven't read that I plan to now. But one of the things that comes from the theme of Ishmael, right, is this: how do you make change? And he does, the narrator does have this moment, and I don't want to give away too much of the plot, but he does have this moment where he's like, I have to find other students. I have to find Ishmael's other students. And I think that is a powerful reminder to all of us that, yeah, as individuals, we can make little changes. But one of the reasons why I gave away so many copies, and when my dad started giving away copies of Ishmael, was to start conversations with people and a way to build connections with people. And so I love that books can do that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm a fan of your podcast and of your book club, is that it is, right in the middle of the pandemic, right? It gave me a connection that I didn't have. And at a time when I needed connections to people. I did also want to say that idea of so if you were talking about making changes in your career. And so one of the things that I did was I stepped outside of public education, and I continue to love public education, even though I criticize it. I wrote a blog post at one point kind of based on James Baldwin's famous quote when he exiled himself to Europe. And he said, I love America dearly, which is why I reserve the right to criticize it harshly. Yes. And that's the way I view public education, right? Is I love public education dearly, but I have to criticize it harshly because it is part of this dominant culture that actually harms people. But one of the things that I've been doing that goes back to something, and I'm going to try and make this as concise as possible. So if you use the phrase a collective reimagining, or maybe Britt did, I don't remember, but one of you used the phrase a collective reimagining of how to make change. Okay, so Britt,
I don't remember what I say, but
well,
like I just be talking.
Sophia wrote it in the note. So
yeah.
I just wanted to pull that out because that collective reimagining is one of the things that when I shifted, I started doing a lot of workshops around this concept of racial healing. And so they're small, they're basically restorative circles focused on how to heal from and about racism. And they've been incredibly powerful for me. And as a facilitator, I'm more often the participant, and I benefit from getting to heal with many, many people over the last 4 years. And one of the books that was really a prominent book for me was Adrienne Maree Brown's book, and I'm going to blank on the name. Holding Change is the name of the book, and it talks about emergent strategies. And in that book, she talks about this idea of a collective reimagining. Why can't we reimagine the world differently? And then the other piece that I want to bring in, and I don't want to do a racial healing workshop, but I would love to do a racial healing workshop, is a psychologist from almost 30 years ago now, named Bobbie Harro. And Bobbie Harro was a queer woman who developed this concept of the cycle of socialization. And that, to me, reading Bobbie Harro's description of the cycle of socialization, and this is where it ties back to Ishmael, the cycle of socialization is mother culture. It is the cultural story and the myths that we tell ourselves. And Bobbie Harro did it from a feminist and a racial perspective that was very powerful. And I use Bobbie Harro's work a lot in my racial healing circles to introduce this concept of we are all products of this society, whether we are Black, white, brown, indigenous, neuroatypical. We're all products of this society. And we have to understand that the driving forces behind this society and the cycle of socialization are not love, and they're not community, and they're not connection. They're based on fear and shame and guilt. And to step outside of that is liberating. And Bobbie Harro's second work was called The Cycle of Liberation. And it was about a creative reimagining. So I don't know. I wanted to share all that because, again, all of these things fit with Ishmael for me. Right. Because Ishmael was like I'm going to say the second book that changed my life. And yet it has influenced every book that I've read since then, in terms of kind of providing the schema and the structure for how I understand the world. And so, again, I go back to the fall of 2021, where I saw this Instagram post that I hadn't seen. There were no posts on hashtag Ishmael for years. And then all of a sudden there's this post like, hey, I want to do an Instagram live about Ishmael. It's a really cool book. And I'm like, oh my God.
Do it.
So I'm honored and a little overwhelmed by being in your presence, both of your presence, because I've been watching you guys do this wonderful concept of a book club / podcast that really feeds me intellectually every month. So I just want to say that.
That's so kind. Thank you. And I just wanted to say too that, I am so thankful that you followed that hashtag because, I think a big part of what we wanted to do with this book club and podcast is not only share the books that we love and talk about it, but to find more people to talk about with it. And I think that this book particularly, kind of to piggyback on something you said about how after reading Ishmael, it had kind of influenced all the other books that you've read since then. And I think that it's either a quote someone said about the book or it's something he mentions in the book about, once you read this book, you don't look at anything else the same. You don't read anything else the same. And I have definitely noticed And I think we've talked about this a bit, Soph and I, that there seems to be, at least for me, particularly after that book, a reoccurring theme that I can't get rid of, even if it's written, like you said, from a completely different perspective and said in a completely different tone, whether you're calling it mother culture or the psychoanalytic thing that you just said from the other lady. But
yeah, we're also
cycle of socialization.
Right. Okay. Yes, that one. It seems like there are so many people.
Calls it.
Yeah, there's so many. Exactly. There's so many people that are already naming this, that have this passion to speak and share, and through story encourage people to do that themselves, which I think is kind of my point. When I was talking about stories being healing, I think that there are so many different ways that we can use stories to right what we see wrong with society and to reach out to people. Another way to bring community together is to share these stories. And Ishmael is really just one of those stories that you can't help but share. I don't think that I have met a person that's read Ishmael and hasn't felt the burning desire to share it. The person that I gave Sophia's book to had told me very shortly after I gave him the book that not only did he read the whole thing in like 2 nights, but he gave it to his mom and had to order another copy because he needed to give that to a friend. And I was like, all right, well, I'm not getting that one back, but it has done well in the world. It's just such a cool experience getting to meet you just through the Ishmael hashtag, and then to having this great conversation where I feel like I can't speak for Sophia, but I feel like we've really all mutually benefited from this, and it's been just such a great experience, and we've really have appreciated you sharing your story and coming on with us and sharing how Ishmael has impacted you in your life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Like I said, I'm really honored to be here. So
oh my God, awesome. Just like mutual love and respect for all of you guys. This is such a good feeling.
So Dawn, I wanted to ask you too, if you wanted to plug anything, your social media, your business, anything out there that you would like to kind of share with everyone.
Yeah. So a little behind the scenes here. One of the things when Britt, you first announced that you were kind of moving from an Instagram Live to a podcast, you were about 2 weeks ahead of an idea that another person that I met over the pandemic on. Actually, we were in a racial healing trainer of trainers workshop. And we've become good friends. Another teacher, middle school teacher from Ontario, Canada, and we'd meet weekly and just have conversations. And we started recording them for posterity. But then we're like, some of our conversations could become a podcast. And so we actually have 2 episodes in the can, but not uploaded anywhere yet. And nice. I was bugging Britt a couple of weeks ago about I'm a Luddite. I'm not a millennial. I'm the oldest. I'm the oldest of the Generation X's that you can get. Not to give away too much my age, but
so what you're saying is you're qualified.
I'm qualified to do what? I don't know.
Talk about life here on this podcast.
I'm not the greatest generation, but no, I saw an Instagram meme the other day that about Generation X having lived through every series of style and fashion twice, and that therefore we should be the most qualified to make comments about fashion today. And I'm like, no. But those two, it's called the Equity Lens podcast, and it's really, we talk about educational equity, educational justice, racial equity, and we will hopefully be dropping those sometime soon. You can follow me at Lead for Equity. The 4 is a number 4 on Instagram, and I sometimes post some things about racial healing, about leadership. I do leadership coaching, and then I do a lot of bird photography. So my private Instagram
I was hoping you'd bring that up.
is mainly bird photography, and I actually because of where I'm at in life, kind of my idea of buying a plot of land is really becoming a nomad and jumping in my car and driving and finding beautiful spots in nature to meditate, to commune with nature, to learn, and that's kind of what I've been doing over the last couple of years, is transitioning my life from one of work to one of back to learning, but learning from and with nature more than learning from and with people. And I plan on doing a lot more of that. And so my bird photography is my true passion right now, in addition to these kinds of conversations.
Oh, that's awesome. And I can vouch for the bird photography. So dope. Big fan of birds, big fan of bird watching, big fan of being outside, big fan of quiet. Love this. Can recommend highly. Dawn, thank you so much for doing this and being here with us today. I can't thank you enough. We really value everything that you've shared with us and putting your story out there, being vulnerable, and, you know, kind of letting people get a peek too into what our education system really can be like. And I think it just serves as a good reminder, this book, hopefully this podcast, but definitely this book, that, you know, perspective change is good all the time. It's good to question the things and look around, you know?
Yeah. Well, again, thank you both for having me. It's been, like I said, I'm a huge fan, and I'm honored to be here more than anything else. And it's been great talking to you. This has been amazing. So thank you.
Oh, well, that's so awesome. And thank you so much. And you can be the #1 fan, because I think you are the only one right now. So top spot.
I'll start the fan club.
Perfect.
Start the fan club, and then that can fund the
okay, and then we'll start the Equality Lens podcast fan club.
Okay.
We'll be ready and waiting in line.
When it launches here.
Right.
I'm really hoping that by the time we release this episode, you got one live.
All right.
But until then,
hey,
that's a good challenge.
Yep.
Good challenge.
We'll follow up with you guys and let you know.
Works.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, as it turns out, our release dates didn't quite align, but be on the lookout for the first episode of Dawn's podcast next year. That's Lead for Equity with the number 4. We hope you've enjoyed today's conversation, and we'll reach out to add to it. You can find us on Instagram at Bimbo Bookshelf, or reach out by email at bimbobookshelf@gmail.com. If you did enjoy today's episode, please consider leaving us a review. It helps us recruit the others. Until next time.